Okay, so we're back, and today we're talking about natural law theory. Okay, so natural law theory, right off the top, is immediately recognizable with Thomas Jefferson's point in the Declaration of Independence, whereby we have it as our inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so in other words, that's a natural law principle. And remember that he's seeing it as inalienable. In other words, this is something that cannot be taken away from us. Okay, it is our right to not have these things taken away from us. And what we're then looking at is that what cannot be taken away from us is therefore intrinsic. It's what we all share. In other words, we share that we have the right to not have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness taken away from us. Okay? So think about that. And then also recognize that Thomas Jefferson was inspired directly by John Locke. Okay? So we have the direct line of thinking from John Locke, whereby John Locke writes that instead of it being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's life, liberty, and the right to own property. Okay? So that's key to understanding that these are elements that not only do we understand natural law, but also this is how we're understanding who we are as Americans as well, interestingly enough, that these are principles that we take to be self-evident, right? And so, like for instance with Locke, we also have this idea of equality as well, that in other words, all men are created equal, okay? And so when we're thinking about all men are created equal or all people are created equal, what we're thinking about is equal treatment, okay? And so that's what we're trying to key into, but one thing we want to make clear is that John Locke also is natural law, but natural law goes even deeper than that. So we have then jumped to the medieval theologian, St. Thomas Aquinas. I believe his dates were 1225 to 1275 or 1224 to 1274, something like that. 13th century thinker who wrote the Summa Theologica. The Summa Theologica is a culmination of all theology up till then. So he was writing a textbook on theology, and within that we have the very basic way that it's understood that we call exit and return. In other words, the way that he organized the way that we're thinking of theology and our understanding of God, because he's a Christian thinker, number one, okay, so this is Christian theology, is that God is perfect, okay, and so God is creating the world, and within God's creation then has an aspect of perfection within it, but it is not entirely as perfect as God. And so in other words, we as human beings, and likewise the earth, all have these aspects of perfection within us that are derived from God, right? But we are not as perfect as God is, okay? So that's exit and return. In other words, the perfection exits God and becomes something that is less perfect, but like perfection, like for instance with human beings. And so likewise within that we have something that is God-given, which is reason. But the key thing to remember there is that Aquinas was not deterministic. So in other words, he still allows for our free will. In other words, we still have the free will to use our reason or not. So in other words, the privation of reason is where we start thinking of things like evil, or the way that people are bad, or doing being immoral, right? So there's the privation of good, in which how it is that we're understanding the difference between acting badly with natural law um, as working away from God's perfection. Okay, so it's a privation from God's perfection, and so we use our reason to get back to the perfection of God. Okay, and so if we think about that, that's exit and return. That is interesting because one thing that's implied in all of that is goodness. So our aim for goodness is a principle that we understand through all of our ethics, be that utilitarianism, natural law, deontology, etc. So in other words, the theories that we work with are always aimed toward goodness, right? So when we say that we are being ethical, we're also recognizing that we're aiming toward goodness, and that's implied when we say something is ethical or not, right? That when it's not, it is not aiming toward goodness. When it is aiming toward goodness, it is thought of as ethically good, moral. If it's not, then it is immoral. Right? So in a way, we could start seeing how that exit and return works through our lives, even in a non-secular way, by way of reason. So always remember that reason is a structuring component for how it is that we're understanding goodness in terms of our way of working in the world, okay, as creatures that were created by God, but yet self-determining. Okay? So in other words, we have the freedom to be who we want to be or not, right? That in other words, we could stray away from that by discarding our, working against our reasoning, etc. Okay? So there's the difference between what's deterministic and also prescriptive. So in other words, what's deterministic is something that is looking like natural laws of nature. So in other words, the speed of light, the laws of gravity, those are a deterministic way in which we understand things, and likewise a descriptive way, okay? Whereas when we start thinking conscientiously by way of our reasoning, then we're getting more into what is innate as well. So in other words, what is innate to human beings is our conscientious reasoning. So in other words, that's to be distinguished from what's deterministic, and likewise to show that there's different ways that we think of reasoning there, right? That in other words, reasoning has the mathematical descriptive way, the logical way, but it likewise has an ethical normative way that it's understood. And that's key to understanding natural law, and likewise the difference between what is descriptive, in other words, the laws of gravity, the speed of light, right? That in other words, the ought aspect there is what we should do in terms of our deterministic understanding of the world, right? That's why data often is mistaken to be normative. But what's happening is that we bring the normative to data without recognizing that, okay? So in other words, we need to recognize that we bring the normative to data and to see that there's a distinction between what is normative and what is descriptive, okay? So that's something that we're not used to doing in our everyday lives, okay? But in ethics class, we do, right? That we make those kinds of distinctions because they need to be clear to us, because if they're not, then we're not understanding our ethical lives very well. And we're seeing our ethical lives getting confused with our deterministic selves, okay? So what's inalienable then is what is intrinsic. And so what is intrinsic then, and what Thomas Jefferson and Locke are keying into, is also something that's intrinsic for Aquinas is reasoning, okay? So in other words, that's the slight crossover from empiricism to rationalism with Locke. So that's why Locke is interesting, because he stands at that edge between rationalist philosophy and strict empiricism. So in other words, Hume is probably a stricter empiricist than his predecessor Locke, right? Okay, so that's getting us to start thinking that what is intrinsic is a way that we understand nature, okay? So in other words, what is natural also has what is logical, okay? So in other words, the Stoics refer to nature as having a logos. In other words, there's a way that nature is ordering itself, and that it is something that is innate to us to recognize that, and we do that by way of reason. Okay, so in other words, reason becomes a structuring principle for how it is that we're working with our understanding of nature. And I think that gets us to the heart of how it is that we're understanding natural law, and probably where we should break. Okay, so thank you and have a good day. Talk to you later.